Good evening and welcome to part 3 of our grief and loss conversation. Tonight, our program is entitled Grief is Where Love Lives First, Hearing and Healing Our Children. My name is Tanya Smith and I'm the Community Relations Coordinator with Gift of Life MOTEP, Minority Organ Tissue Transplant Education Program. I can't believe we started this conversation over 6 months ago in February with Dr. Jennifer Matthews from Oakland University, who helped us define grief and shared how we face and manage through these heartbreaking experiences. We all know that the last 18 months have been challenging, and everyone has experienced some form of grief and loss. But tonight, we want to focus on how do we help our children, our youth. Thank you for taking time from your schedule to hear from our elite panel of presenters who today collectively have over 80 years of experience hearing and healing our children through trauma and grief and teaching them how art can help with the healing process. So before we get started, we wanted to do a welcome from our MOTEP director. I don't believe Ramona is on yet, but she will join us later, and we'll make sure she gets on screen. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and present our first presenter. Our first presenter is Connie Black-Pond. Connie has over 35 years of experience navigating our children through trauma. She's a co-founder of Southwest Michigan's Children Trauma Assessment Center. And in 2017, she retired as the clinical director. So great we can do virtual. Connie is from the west side of the state. I love talking with her about preparing for this presentation. So without further ado, Connie will share about how our children and how we can help them deal with trauma. Thank you, Connie, and welcome.
Thank you, Tanya. And I'm really glad to be a part of your conversation. And I just look at the title, Grief is Where Love Lives First. And it just rings so true in terms of the grief and loss is such a part of the changes that kids experience when they have been exposed to traumatic events. So we're going to look at some slides, and I know we're going to have Q&A after we've each had a chance to talk. Please put in comments any questions that you have, and if we have time to get to those during the presentation, I certainly will try to do that. So again, and we can go to the next slide. And I just, in all my years of working with traumatized kids, there's just so many different ways that we have talked about trauma and so many different words, adverse childhood experiences, poverty and homelessness and natural disasters, community violence, witnessing violence, whether that's witnessing parental violence or watching a sibling be harmed. Complex trauma, which is early and repeated exposure to trauma in a caregiving system. Sexual, physical abuse, trafficking, medical trauma, including our most recent exposure to COVID and what that's meant in our lives. Traumatic loss and grief, and more we're recognizing the significance and honoring, very much honoring historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, and then the everyday demonstration of ethnic and racial trauma through hatred and racism. And there's so many other ways that we describe experiences, but epigenetics is one of those ways that we know that even our DNA markers for stress responses can be altered as a result of our exposure to these events that may be traumatizing and may not be. We may rebound from some of these experiences, but but we have to honor the potential for how these events can really overwhelm a child's ability to cope and to feel safe in the world, and to be able to develop the skills of regulating their mood and building confidence and building competencies and building resilience. So we can go to the next slide. So just some ideas that are so important to hold on to when we talk about how trauma affects kids, because trauma and trauma exposure are so much more than just the event itself. And when that event is over, there's a continuing impact from those experiences, especially if they're ongoing or if there's multiple different types of exposures. But primarily, we have to honor the danger and safety, our concerns for kids exposed to trauma and loss. And they can exhibit a wide range of behaviors that, and we'll look at some of those on the next slide, but some of their behaviors really reflect their reactions to trauma and loss and their attempts to survive and to function the best and do the best that they can. We want to honor that relationships, including protective people and protective factors, might be an environment, it could be school, could be a church, it could be a community, but protective factors and resiliency factors can reduce the impact of a traumatic exposure on a child's functioning and on their development and on their emotional well-being. And we think of those factors as including very much positive supports. Even just one positive support in a child's environment is enough to help them build resiliency. Their ability to manage their emotions, to identify emotions, and their ability to experience competency and success. All of those are part of building resiliency. And that may exist before a traumatic event, and it may be something that we are trying to build in our interventions following an event. We also very much have to we have to honor that traumatic events often generate secondary traumas, life changes, and distressing reminders. So kids who disclose abuse, or kids who are discovered to have been exposed to violence or a murder or abuse or even a medical event, they may experience moves or separations, changes in friends, changes in their belief about the world and faith and themselves. And events strongly can influence their development and get in the way of opportunities for growth. For all the children that I worked with in foster care, I often was just struck by how limited access many of them had to opportunities for developmental growth and for resiliency building activities like after-school activities or art classes or musical classes and groups to participate with. And through all of their experiences and their secondary traumas, it is so important to kind of consider that when kids also experience a violation of the social contract, including that the legal system doesn't believe them or doesn't protect them, or maybe even blames them for their own victimization. And then and ethical issues that we struggle with, especially during times of stress. But those issues can be experienced by children as a violation and a betrayal of what they expect will be a protective system, or should be or could be. So it is that challenge that is very much a part of the ongoing stress that kids experience. And these ideas come from the 12 core concepts for understanding traumatic stress as it relates to kids and families. And that this is just a few of the core concepts kind of merged together, but you can see the full list if you're interested on the nctsn.org website, and just kind of search the core concepts and you'll find that. What we know is that as kids adapt to traumatic exposure, and they especially ongoing exposure, that they must do the best that they can and use the resources that they have to survive and protect themselves. And often what we see is traumatic parts or traumatic states that kids kind of float in and out of, not necessarily intentionally, but it's driven by the environment and what triggers the memories of fear and harm and lack of safety. And these states often follow, basic survival strategies: fight, flight, freeze, both the kind of the deer in the headlight freeze, like what's coming at me, but also the kind of freeze that results in complete immobility and kind of a collapse into doing nothing. And that state may be absolutely crucial for their survival when they're dealing with a violent and potentially very dangerous perpetrator or bear or community or neighborhood. We look at the state of submission, and often there's questions: why didn't you run? Why didn't you fight? Why didn't you do something? But the state of submission, which you can see here, allows kids to reduce the likelihood of further harm. But you can see under all of these different states the behaviors that we often see that are baffling at times, especially when kids move in and out of the states. And one of the most confusing states is the attachment state, because kids more than anything else have to protect their attachments. They depend on people to care for them. So if a caregiver or a relative or a person in authority who kind of holds the strings, and this is true with adults, if it's their boss that is exploiting them and abusing them, there's a part of them that really needs to protect the relationship to ensure their safety and their survival. So I know the print is small on this, and you can also kind of Google this, and the book that is referenced here is Janina Fisher's Healing the Fragmented Parts of Self, and which is a wonderful book. But to know that we might see kids kind of based on what's happening in the environment, they may flip from kind of this angry, get away from me, to I got to get out of here, to kind of I really don't want you to leave me, and just a complete collapse. And we could see that all within, a half hour or less or more. So understanding this is all part of survival, and doing the best they can is so much better than judging. And labeling and even diagnosing, and kind of relying on diagnosis to help us understand what to do next. And then the last slide is, and this is a very short kind of elevator intro to trauma. But if we go ahead and switch to the last slide. Thank you. So we think, so what can we do? And I just mentioned, like, this first item, that instead of judging and labeling and assuming kids are intentional and manipulative and bad or evil or all the different labels that they get, ask yourself, ask them, even if you're working with them, what purpose does the behavior or the mood, even depression and high anxiety, what purpose does that serve to provide them a sense of safety and control? It's not a question that get asked often, but it's one that can lead you in the right direction in terms of identifying what's going on and helping them find other ways to feel safe. Believing that kids need connection and a sense of belonging, even if they push people away to find safety, even if that's their strategy, to do what we can within our power to make connection one-on-one or in groups, getting them with other kids, helping them feel successful and wanted and a contributor, helps them experience a sense of purpose and a sense of belonging and a sense of relatedness that is so important to the human survival. And remember that distress, that high anxiety and distress and cries of distress and grief, the kind of grief that kind of pulls people in, and even rage in its most like outrageous form, are always to seek connection. And it may not feel like that, but it is that. Rage is a way of saying, look at me and can you get it? Can you understand what's going on with me and help me? So helping kids heal with our support reduces their distress, especially if we kind of do the skills of regulation with them, kind of walk the walk with them rather than just expecting them to do it. And it will relieve our distress as well. And finally, seek out help, and from somebody that understands trauma. There's a lot of good therapies, and a lot of good therapies that are not trauma informed and not intended for traumatized kids, but and those therapies can be helpful. But if a child's been exposed to trauma informed or trauma focused treatment is by far more effective, and it's generally attachment kind of enhancing treatment. So it is not just fixing the child, it is helping the child within their relationships with others. So thank you. And I will stop here and take questions later. Thank you.
Connie. Wow, Connie, thank you so very much for your presentation. If you don't mind, we'll go ahead and go to a couple questions that we have for you. Is that okay? You're on mute. Okay. Um, your information was very, very detailed, and I guess one question that comes to mind is, what happens to children that don't face or get their trauma treated? They're down a road of destruction, almost sounds like.
Well, yeah, it can end up down a road of kind of limited choices and increased labeling and increased kind of poor functioning, and that can be a very poor outcome. What we understand about kids that don't get treated is that it doesn't just go away. Time does not heal trauma. Time may reinforce the survival strategies that kids have. So if they lean on fighting or running, then those strategies get reinforced over time, and they just learn to keep running, keep hiding, or they may develop addictions to not feel and to kind of run from their body. They may become disconnected from their body and from their emotions as a way to survive, and that gets reinforced. And so they aren't able to manage well without maybe checking out or without kind of avoiding stressful situations. So that interferes not only in their functioning, but it contributes to what then becomes intergenerational trauma, because their parenting style will be impacted by all of those survival strategies, and will then influence their own children's ability to learn, to manage, and to be resilient.
Wow. So there's no such thing as a child mentally strong enough to work through their trauma. They really need to get professional counseling.
Well, there are children, because they have a lot of resiliency factors. They may be really good academically, and they may have some athletic prowess, and they may have a wonderful support system that can experience many of the experiences that were up on the previous slide, and they will bounce back. They may be still affected, but they may not be as profoundly affected as a child who does not have that support system. So we often say one of the biggest factors is that children be believed and listened to and heard, which is, again, why this conversation is so important.
Wow. Thank you so much, Connie. Right now, I don't see any additional questions in the chat, but I'm sure there'll be some later. And if there are, so please hold on. And thank you so much for your very detailed presentation.
You're welcome.
Our next presenter is Dr. Sean Fuqua. Sean is a licensed professional counselor for more than 20 years. She's co-owner and licensed professional counselor institute. Sean is also an author of a series of children's books. The title of the books are Growing Places with Bailey. And Sean, again, is virtually here and really is residing in Atlanta, Georgia. So we thank her for coming this evening and sharing with us. We've addressed the trauma with our children and what it looks like and how we can help them. And as you see at the bottom of the screen, Henry Ford Sandcastles is a resource if you're in need of help in getting your child evaluated for trauma. But Sean is going to share with us how grief affects our children. But welcome and thank you, Sean. Dr. Sean.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I am Dr. Sean, the LPC, which is licensed professional counselor, and I am one member of the mental health community where you have social workers, psychologists, and we're all here to help, heal our community, help move our people forward. And I want to thank you all for having this conversation. As you mentioned, you started it a while ago, and now we are talking about children. And I hope that we can, by the end of the series, normalize mental health and also how to help a very important population, a very vulnerable population, our children. So again, I want to thank the Gift of Life for starting this conversation and inviting me to be a part of the conversation. So I want to talk about grief and children. And so I want to share with you, where do we go from here? We talked about trauma, and we know that trauma leaves residuals, and that's what she was talking about. And even when we speak on specifically grief, and we can go to the next slide, I wanted to share like what happens when we talk about grief. And so when we bring grief into the situation, grief is associated with a pain, with a loss. And so for most of the time when we hear grief, we think about the loss of life. And so, yes, death is really that ultimate connection to loss. However, what we do know in discussing grief is that there can be a loss of moving from your school or from your friends. There can be loss with an incarcerated parent. There can be loss in a divorce. And so any type of separation, you can get that loss and have some of those things that are similar to grief that you see with the loss of life. And so for the, and then we have bereavement, and bereavement is in that state of loss. And so we're going to go to the next slide to kind of go through, for the purpose of this conversation, of what these things mean. So grief is characterized by that deep feeling, that sense of sorrow or sadness that you feel. And then loss is to recognize there has been a change and something is no longer visible or something is missing. Bereavement, like I said, is that state of loss usually associated with death. A lot of times when you hear bereavement, you think about bereavement time at work or bereavement compensation, something to that effect. But that is a period of time or just kind of this holding space where you're going through mourning or feeling that grief, feeling that heaviness. Some other things to consider when we're talking about grief is how that loss happened. Was it a traumatic loss? A traumatic loss where there was a shock to your being and violence in the circumstance, or a sudden loss where there's unexpected loss and there's a disbelief, but yet the mind is trying to reason behind that loss. And then there's the anticipated loss, often seen where someone has a health challenge and you know that the end may be near. And what we have noticed with anticipated loss is that sometimes the grieving or the behavior seen with grieving can start before the actual loss happens. One of the things that's important when you're talking about children and loss is the stages and ages. And so for the purpose of the presentation, we kind of have some ages here. So we have 2 to 7, that's the infants and things like that. But I also want to make sure that it's important to know that it can vary. This isn't a hard age sense, but to give you an idea of like the younger children. So the first thing that I tell people is that infants can feel emotions. In fact, we all realize that we can feel before we can speak. And so what that means is that if there is turmoil, or even like Mrs. Black mentioned, a traumatic situation, an infant can feel that and hold that. They just have not been given the language just yet to explain what's going on with them. So even when you talk about grief or grieving around a child, they can feel that before they have time to process that or understand what they're feeling. When we are talking about young children, I'm talking about the age of 2 to 7. And usually in young children, when you are dealing with grief, one of the first signs is unusual behavior. And when we're working with young children, we also are looking at sleeping habits and eating habits. Those are usually signs that see some type of difference when they are going through some type of emotional issue, or if they're trying to process the emotion. Something is wrong again. They don't necessarily have the language to understand that I'm grieving or I'm hurting or I'm in pain, but they act it out in their behavior. They can be irritable. And again, remember, we're talking about loss. Have they moved? Have you had a parent go away to the military? What type of changes that have happened in the household? And then again, the things that are more obvious, if someone has passed away. A child can be very clingy at that age, or be afraid for other living relatives to leave for a long period of time. So again, you can see a strong sense of attachment and not wanting to leave. Also during that age, behavior regression. So you might see a child who may be wetting the bed again or sucking their thumb again. And so these are some of the obvious signs that there's some type of emotional irregulation or dysregulation that's happening. The next stage or age is the 8 to 12-year-old. And so again, language is better, able to communicate some things. So again, you're going to see some of those same things we talked about with the younger children, but again, because they're older, they're able to talk. They might not have the right words to express what's going on. And so they might tell you they don't have anything to say, or it may come out looking like anger, but you're usually going to see some strong, intense emotions at this age. They may ask a lot of questions. And so one of the things we talk about with grief is when you are talking about grief with younger children, you do want to use the correct terms. You don't want to say that the person is sleeping. you might say the body isn't working anymore. You might say they're not coming back, they're not returning. With the older children, you do want to be more forthcoming about the loss of life, and to talk about death. It can be very difficult and very hard because usually when we are talking about grief, the adults are usually grieving as well. We also see with the older children, they can tell you they had a nightmare and they're able to, so we talked about the disruption of sleep, they're able to tell you what's going on. We also see a range of emotions. So one minute they can be happy and the next minute things can just kind of shift and you don't understand what's going on. And also you will see children complain about headaches or stomach aches, and a lot of times that's associated with anxiety or things that emotions that are going through the body, and not really able to understand again that there are emotions going through the body because just like we said earlier, they don't go anywhere. You still hold that. And so we want to be able to teach children how to process those emotions, and so they may complain about body pain. And then you have your teenagers, and I often say teenagers experience it the same way adults do. So they may not want to be around people. They may want to keep their social calendar full. They will begin to, some of them, indulge in drinking or smoking, reckless behavior. You may see irritability or some decline at school or work. Also, the opposite, the desire to be perfect. Um, you may see them uncomfortable talking about the loss or the death. They don't want to talk to anybody, but at the same time, they want someone to just listen without judgment. And so, in teenagers, you usually see the same thing that adults go through because we have not been taught how to grieve. Again, it's an uncomfortable place for us because it hurts when we talk about the loss or the loss of life or things that pain or trouble us. Let's see the next slide. So what is normal? One of the things that I want to make sure that I reiterate is that grief is not a diagnosis, and grief is normal with any type of loss. Like I said, we can have great loss, but we can also have small losses. And one of the things that we should do is to begin to recognize that when a loss happens, hurt is there. Grief can last from 6 months to 4 years to longer. One of the things that is important is that you really shouldn't put a cap on how long a person should grieve. But we do know, like if you have extended a situation where you're recognizing the change in the behavior, you want to get professional help. Also, when we see the grieving process go on for a long time, we call that prolonged grief. And at that point, you should be talking or working with someone. But again, it is not a diagnosis. What happens when you bring in a professional is they can help you process the emotions and help you work through what's normal and what's typical without raising a lot of concern. So again, I reiterate working with a professional. Also being aware of the year of first, okay, the year of first. So that first year, there is the birthday, there is a holiday. With my son, who, yes, I said my son, my husband's son, their mother, they lost their mother. And so even graduation, while it had been a while, but that was the ceremony where she should have been. And so recognizing that during those first or a wedding or something where that person should be there, you may see the person who is grieving, the child, the family, you just see a decline in the behavior. And so recognizing that grief can come in waves where you can have a chunk of time where things are going well, and then even without consciously realizing it, you just kind of, this heaviness comes over you. And so just being aware of the first. How are other people reacting to the loss? How are the adults reacting to the loss? How do the adults respond to the child who is grieving? As I said, it can be moving from your friends and going to a new school. You can have a parent who is incarcerated, and so the child, how are the adults responding to the child? And so making sure that we model that grief is okay, and that emotions will go up and down. The next question I have after that is there emotional closeness and a safety in expressing your emotions? Very often we haven't been taught the power of emotions and how they affect us, and making room for them, especially the ones that are uncomfortable. And so a lot of times in a natural response, we shut down, or we don't want to talk about them. And so again, how our emotions played out in the family will make a difference of how the child will process or play out those emotions as well. And then the other thing is, what other stresses are going on in your life? And so if there are other things that are happening, if you have a child who may have a learning disability, these are things that can compound it. If there is a financial stress in the home, if there's violence in the home, so there's other things that can compound having a child process or deal with grief naturally. So that's why it's important to work with a team, or to have some professional people in to help you determine what's normal and what we need to look at a little bit closer and help a child process and deal with. The task of grief. So this is a acronym that I borrowed, and this is called TEARS. And one of the things that I try to encourage people to do is show your tears. Tears are often a way to help you process when you don't have words. The first part is the T, and that's to accept the reality of the loss. When you're talking about a loss of life, especially if it is a tragic loss, sometimes you don't want to deal with it, or you don't want to speak about it. And a tragic circumstance is very heavy. It's heavy to even process. But what I tell people is, you don't want to deny it. You don't want to run from it. We can be patient and wait, but we do have to move through the process. And so one of the things that is helpful with children is helping them come up with rituals or ways to process it. And so expressing the arts, or for the younger children, play therapy, of just kind of giving them a way to express and work through things. The next is the E, and that's experience the pain of the loss. And when we speak of experience the pain of the loss, we are really talking about putting words to your emotions. And it can be a range of emotions, from anger to longing to sadness, sorrow, anguish, despair, guilt. Often with younger children, if there is a loss of a parent or a sibling or even a pet, sometimes they blame themselves if we don't have conversations around grief, death, dying. And so again, helping children put words to those things that they are feeling. A is adjusting to new life. And this is new life, your new life, without that person around. And even when I think about adjusting, it's not just moving through, but it's just, this is my new reality. And so in my new reality, how do I move through my new reality? And sometimes we do need help. And that's why I say again, I wholeheartedly encourage people to work with a professional. Reinvesting in the new reality. And reinvesting in the new reality is about what does this look like, but how do I still honor and hold the memory dear of that person or the thing that I lost while I'm moving through this? And so one of the things that with my son, he wears his mother's scarf when he cooks. We went through doing a shadow box and taking some of her things that she made. She was an artist, and putting them in a shadow box. We painted And so, often giving him, and he's a teenager, or now he's a young man, but when he was a teenager, we're giving him choices. And that's also important when you're working with children, because that helps empower them, that they have some say so how they move through this. Then it's S, which is seeing yourself through the process and just recognizing that this is going to take time. Even if you're working with a child, the youngest child, this is going to take time. Giving them that space, knowing that it's going to take time. And again, I mentioned that when you're dealing with a child and a loss, usually there's some type of adult who experience a loss as well. And so making sure that you see yourself through the process and you're getting yourself some help as well too. So what are we going to do next? One of the things when you're working with younger children is to set a routine or maintain a routine, create some type of routine. Routines for younger children help create a stability and a sense of security. And so behind the loss, the great ones as well as to the smallest ones, creating a new routine or maintaining your routine. Don't allow, try not to fix the problem. When we're talking about difficult emotions or uncomfortable emotions, don't try to change, fix, or take them away. Again, just giving them space to feel their way through. And that's why the arts become very important, or what we call expressive therapy. That's why play becomes important. They're asking questions, allow them to ask questions, which goes to the next one, answer questions honestly. Provide choices. I mentioned that already. Giving them choices helps to empower them, even with the youngest child. Do you want to wear this shoe? Do you want to wear this shoe? Do you want to wear this color? Do you want to wear this color? With the older child, just like I said, do you want to do something in honor of her memory? I would ask them, do you want to go back home because we're in Georgia? Just kind of giving him choices. How do you want to honor? How do you want to do this? Sometimes it's I want to be all in, and sometimes it's I don't want to do anything, and that's okay. It's nothing more, it's nothing less, because what we do know is everybody grieves differently. We just need to make space and allow people to grieve. And then a desperate task. I want to say that, especially when you're dealing with children, they may not be as enthusiastic about school or, activities that they want to do, or they may go all in, but just being aware that that change may be happening and it could be related to some type of loss or disruption. And then establishing your support system, other adults, and again, as I mentioned, professionals. Take a deep breath and relax. Grief is an uncomfortable subject. Death is something that no one likes to talk about. And so the first thing that I would say is admit that this is uncomfortable. Also, being present and being in the moment. Acknowledge those feelings, whatever it is, grief, sadness, anger, loneliness. Recognize sometimes there are no words, but your presence can be very important. And so just sitting next to them, holding them, especially with younger children, just hold and kiss them. Double down on the nurturing and the kissing. Realize that healing from grief takes time. It takes time. And be willing to seek professional help if you feel like this is overwhelming or too much for you. There are people out there who specialize in grief, who specialize with working in children, and we want to help you through the process. So let's go to the next slide. So I have, since I know the MOTAP organization is based in Detroit, I have some resources. These organizations work specifically with children. You have advanced counseling services with multiple locations, New Oakland Family Services, Lincoln Behavioral Health, which is in Redford, and then the Children's Center. The other thing that I would say is that, again, I know they work with children specifically, but you also have therapists, and you can go to the next slide, which can be found on a very popular and widely used Psychology Today. You can put in any the type of therapist you're looking for. If you're looking for someone with children, And I would encourage people to reach out for help. I tell people that recent changes over the last 10 years, every health insurance has a mental health rider, so they have to offer it to you. Your health savings account can be used for therapy as well. If you're going through psychology today, if you see sliding fee scales, you can call and you can ask. And therapists, there are therapists who offer sliding fee scales. There are programs in schools when you have the school not only has a social worker assigned to it, even if it's not one in school, and mental health support. So there's in public school districts, they have people assigned for that. And so reaching out to your school district and seeing as they also have resources as well. And so that's all I have. I am a mental health warrior. I am happy to help and so glad that we are having this conversation.
Dr. Sean, what a powerful presentation. Thank you so much for defining the ages and the stages. And it's great to know that grief is not a diagnosis. It's normal. I like the way you started that off in that one slide. And what to do next. Take a deep breath. Just be more aware of the feelings of our children. And I think one thing that kind of stuck with me too was that even the babies can feel loss. So thank you so much for that presentation. We very much appreciate it. We have one final presenter. We'll go to her, and thank you again, Dr. Sean. So we've learned about trauma and grief. Now let's talk about how art can help our children work through their trauma and grief. Our final presenter tonight is Dr. Sean Renee Foreman. Sean is an educator with over 25 years of experience working in urban elementary and secondary school settings. She is the founder of Promise, an art program created to address complex social stressors and help our children face their trials. So let's hear from Dr. Foreman.
Good evening, everybody. And I, too, am glad that you're having this conversation. It is well overdue and needed every day. So as Tanya stated, my name is Dr. Sean Renee Foreman. I am the executive director of an art program that's called Promise. And Promise stands for Peers to Responding to Overlooked Matters in Social Environments. And so I'm going to have you go to the next slide, and we're going to talk about exactly what Promise offers. And so I'm going to take off my glasses because sometimes it's hard for me to read with them on. So basically, what this program does is that we're dedicated basically to using the creative processes in visual arts, performing arts, and literary arts to be able to, along with character education, to be able to give students opportunities to heal. And Promise came about in 2015. As Tanya stated, working as an urban educator for 25 years, I have been seeing lots of challenging behaviors from children. And a lot of times these behaviors resulted in exactly what Mrs. Black and Dr. Sean spoke about, those characteristics of children who were experiencing loss and grief. And so if we can move to the next slide. So the next slide basically talks about what actually is Promise. And so who are the peers? And what Promise does is work with inner city youth. And sometimes these children be considered at risk. And at risk can be defined in many ways. But for the purpose of what Promise does, it is those youth who are in danger of negative present and future events that definitely result from complex correlated risk factors. And so what are some of those risk factors or overlooked matters? It already kind of been mentioned in both of our presenters' presentations. Some of those risk overlooked matters are racism, mental health, grief, trauma, and loss, as we've been talking about, violence, peer pressure, and then educational attainment. And then what are these social environments? And so our social environments basically are the spaces that we are educated in, the spaces we live in, as well as the institutions and the people that we interact with. And so our social environments are culture, school and home. And now that we have social media, that is also one of our social environments. And so can we move to the next slide? And so what we do at Promise is that we use character education traits and we connect them to those art processes that we talked about, either in visual arts, and we'll talk about that in the next slide, visual arts, performing arts, or literary arts. And so each one of these traits are introduced with an art process in order to make the connection to real life events. And so addressing these social issues, they're connected to real life events. And what we do is address the social issues and emotions that the children are experiencing. And so the next slide, now I'm going to say, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back. Can you go back? I'm sorry, because I do want to just mention some of those character education traits that we do look at. And these are just a few. There's plenty other that we definitely could look at. So we look at self-discipline. We look at fairness and cooperation, caring, what it means to trust, courage, integrity, honesty, respect, perseverance, and responsibility. And so lessons are created around those particular traits, and then we couple them with art making process. So if you can move to the next slide. And so some of those things that we do in the particular disciplines, we use, these are just a few things in each one of those disciplines that we actually use. So in the visual arts, we have projects where children are painting, they're drawing and illustrating, they're using their phones because they have them all the time as a device for photography. We're creating sculpture. We have people that are musicians who are working with students with voice and instrument and electronic. And our electronic component has to do with DJing, using beat machines and drum machines. So kids are really into that right now. And that just helps to bring that expression out of them using those types of devices. With dance, we do a lot of movement. And of course, there's acting and drama and theater. And then for literary, we have children use their voices in terms of spoken word. We're writing poetry, creative imaginative writing, and also novels. And so the next slide. And so here's basically just talks about a few things about how art can heal. So what scientific research has basically shown us is that it has been proven that art has the ability to change our physical state and our attitude. And some of the ways that these changes take place is that they affect the brainwave patterns, our nervous system, hormonal balance, and neurotransmitters. So we basically are creating a connection between the mind and body when we're engaged in creative process. We can boost our immune system. What it does is it moves us from being in a state of stress to deep relaxation, which also creates a sense of calmness and well-being. It also can move us from fear to inspiration and creativity, which helps with decreasing stress and anxiety, increasing self-awareness and self-esteem, as well as mindfulness. And it also provides multi-sensory learning. And so we actually are going to, in the next slide, we're just going to use a lesson that would be taught to children who are experiencing some type of trauma. And so the lesson is actually called Grounding Scribble. And so in Grounding Scribble, the purpose of this art directive basically is to ground yourself when you're feeling overwhelmed with an emotion. And that emotion could be, it could be loss, it could be stress, it could be anxiety. That emotion can come on by lots of things in terms of trauma. And so what you are going to do is that basically, once again, the process of grounding is where you become aware of yourself in the present moment instead of focusing on ourselves in the midst of our anxiety or what other overwhelming emotion we're having. And then we're thinking about being mindful as well. So what that is basically a mental state where you're focusing on being present in that moment at that time and recognizing and accepting the feelings that you have and the thoughts, and you're thinking about your body sensations. And so the character trait that goes along with this project of grounding Scribble is self discipline. And basically, that's the ability to be able to control your feelings and overcome your challenges. And so, with the next slide, we're actually going to do a grounding Scribble. And so, what you need to know with this lesson is you literally can do this anywhere. You can have any kind of materials. It could be in the most private place, or it can be somewhere out in the open. And so the materials that I stated that we're going to use for this is if you have them or whatever's available, is crayons, markers, pencils, ballpoint pens. If you have paint, it could be watercolor, oil, or acrylic, and of course you need paper. And so the first direction is basically what you're going to do, and I'm going to use the whiteboard so that I can demonstrate, and then I'll show you some examples of what this grounding Scribble looks like once it's finished. And so with the first direction, what you're going to do is first freely just make some loops, swirls, and lines without lifting your writing utensil from the paper. So I'm going to be using a dry erase marker and a dry erase board. And all I'm doing is allowing myself to be free. And that's number 3. You're allowing yourself to be free to let go of that current emotion that you're feeling presently, and you're just drawing. And so you're going to just take your writing utensil, and all you're doing is literally making loops and swirls. And know that the more that you create, the more complex it gets, and the less that you create, the less complex that it gets. And so if you can see that, all I did was just made these loops, swirls, cross over my lines until I was finished. And then once you're done with that, I used purple. I have some other colors. You're going to color in the spaces that you created. Now you can color as many spaces in as you want, or you can color as less spaces as you want, and it's up to you. And know that there's no right or wrong way in this art directive. And if you happen to go off the page, it's okay. Maybe it's intentional. It's up to you. So I'm just going to take a blue dry erase marker, and I'm just kind of coloring the spaces. I'm going to do it a little sloppy just for sake of time and to make sure that we get a chance to see the other examples that I have. And so you can choose to do every other space. You can do every space. It's up to you. The other thing is, if you say you don't have paper available, if you're sitting in a doctor's office and you're overwhelmed with whatever the reason you're there for, if you have a receipt in your purse, an envelope that your child can use, anything, they can create this Scribble. It'll allow them to become a little calmer, and actually just to deal with what's going on with them presently. And so I'm going to show you some examples of just some that were done. This was done on, and I'm going to bring it a little closer, on a scrap book that I had that was getting thrown out in a garbage can. Pulled out some pages and just did my scribbles using just a black marker. I added some lines in, added some dots in. Once the process is done and you're starting to really work on it, it does become calming. But at any point, if this ever becomes overwhelming for the child, just have them walk away, put it to the side, and come back to it later when they're ready to work on it again, because this is not something that needs to be finished. It should be started in terms of getting them to be a little calmer. Now here's one done with all of the spaces colored in. And then our last example is one where just some of the spaces were colored in. Not everything was colored in. Some of the sheets were half sheets. Some of the this sheet was a whole sheet. And so this is something that definitely can ground a child that's feeling overwhelmed, just being faced with lots of challenges. And it helps, like I said, to definitely calm you down. And so on the next slide, what I've put there is contact information for Promise, which is peers responding to overlooked matters in social environments. This program is a nonprofit program. It operates during school. In January of 2022, it'll actually be able to operate during school. But normally it operates after school and during the summertime. It's a 16-week intensive program where children come. Either the program comes to where children are in school and church, or any other organization, or here soon they'll be able to come to a facility that I've acquired. And so I'm going to go to the next slide if there's any questions and answers. Q&A. I want to say thank you to Tanya Smith and the Gift of Life and the Angels of Life for allowing this presentation to take place, and the other presenters for presenting that wonderful information that can be used, and just the opportunity to be able to disseminate some knowledge, learn, and grow.
Thank you so much, Dr. Foreman. We really appreciate it. I do have one quick question for you. What are your thoughts about kids using the cell phone to help with calming them?
So I'm going to tell you, cell phones aren't going away. Sometimes you got to pick your battles, and that is not one I choose to pick. So there are several apps that children can use. There's actually has a calming music app that can be downloaded for free, where if there's a timeout that's needed, they can pop in those AirPods, listen to that music. There's another meditation app that I actually use that allows them to learn how to breathe and to count down. And I mean, like I said, I use a cell phone as a device of photography. I'm a photographer. I've taught my kids who I teach, because I'm teaching art now, I've taught them how to use that phone in positive ways, more than just being on social media and putting filters on. I've taught them how to use it as a photographic device. So yes, I think a cell phone can be a good method to be able to use with some of these strategies.
Great. To our attendees, I know we're slightly over our time, but we started a little late. So if you could give me another 3 or 4 minutes, we will have a raffle for those of you that are on and attend before we dismiss. So please hang on. There were a couple, there was a question earlier in the chat from Deborah Deering, saying how can these behaviors impact them as adults long term? And it was about 6:55. So I'm not sure if that was a question for Connie or a question for Dr. Sean Fuqua.
Well, I saw that right after I kind of went on mute. So I think it was related to the behaviors that I was talking about, and a follow up to your question, like what happens if trauma goes untreated. And similar to what I had said to you, is that the behaviors and the survival strategies, the attempts to do the best they can, which show up as fight, flight, kind of panic attacks, submission or collapse, depression. Depression is a survival strategy. If we look at it outside of just a mental health diagnosis, so it can just become persistent, and adults will continue to react to the triggers that, whether they remember the context or not, because as was mentioned, babies feel the trauma and the loss and the grief, and so they can actually reenact kind of their defense to that loss, or their defense to that trauma, even into adulthood. It's what we call intrinsic memory, and people get less and less connected to what is happening to them today and what happened to them 30 years ago. So part of the work we do is to help people kind of reconnect with their experiences in a safe way. And I love the strategies that have been talked about, because it helps people who are so afraid of feeling the terror, the distress. It helps them safely kind of reconnect. And in our attachments, our losses, and our distress around relationship, clearly, if untreated, can affect our relationships with partners and families and our children and our grandchildren. And those reactions just become so persistent and defensive. And because they're doing the best they can, and that's what they've got in terms of tools.
Thank you so much, Connie. I really appreciate it. We have some very positive comments from Ms. Graham. Thank you for this conversation. This is such an important topic. We often, when adults experience loss, the children are forgotten. So it says, so informative. Thank you from Mary Bloom. Sharon Wilson, excellent forum. Thank you for the information, healing. So we thank you, ladies, for taking the time out of your schedules to share with us on this very important topic. And I also want to be full disclosure, saying that I just want to say thank you to my line sisters, Dr. Sean and Dr. Sean. And I'm so very proud of the work that you all are doing to help heal our children. So I thank you, my sister. I love you. And this program to the attendees are recorded, so we'll send it out in a link in the next day or two. But our winner of the raffle goes to, very first one was Trina Graham. Trina, if you could email, what are you running the names? What are we doing? Okay, so Trina Graham, there you go. Trina Graham was the winner. And we may even do a second drawing as well. So look for that information coming in your email. So one last thing, this is the third part of our 4-series conversation. Our next conversation will be actually a live therapy session, so we can get comfortable knowing what therapy looks like, what it can do to help transform people and transform their lives. So save the date for Thursday, November 11th, 2021. We'll have Dr. Jennifer Matthews back to conduct a live therapy session. So thank you so much. I appreciate you, and I love you all, and nothing you can do about it. So thank you, and have a great